God-man. This is why we call Jesus the God-man. And in this status of being both God and man, we find some interesting paradoxes. If you look at Jesus' life, it's like the whole life was a life of paradox. We know He was hungry, but He fed 5,000 people. We know He was thirsty, yet He turned water into wine. We know that He was tired, yet we know He walked on water. That's the great paradox of Christianity. The great paradox of Christianity, and the part that's so hard for people to grasp, I think, is when we consider that the God of the universe would visit His creation, and not just in human form as a phantom or as a vision, but literally would visit His creation by taking on the very nature of that creation. Jesus had a fully human nature. Does that just give you shivers? To think that Jesus, who is God, had taken upon Himself a fully, absolute human nature. Billy Graham used the word stoop. He said this. He said, Jesus did stoop when He became a man. As a man, He was a little lower than the angels in His humanity, although without losing any of His divine nature. Billy put it pretty simply. Let me say it again. He said, Jesus did stoop when He became a man. As a man, He was a little lower than the angels in His humanity, although without losing any of His divine nature. You see, in the incarnation, Christ stooped. In the incarnation, He condescended. In the incarnation, He came down to us because we can't go up to Him. You can't become a God. Hope that's not a surprise. Perhaps if you came from another religion, maybe that's a surprise. Because there are some religions that teach that man can become a God if given enough time and effort and energy, but that is a false truth, otherwise known as a lie. You aren't going to become God. You don't get to do good and be a God. But God is limitless, so where we could not lift up and become Him, He can condescend and become one of us. But the question still remains. Why? Why do it that way? Why? What is the need in becoming a man? As I said, the answer that we're going to look at today, He became a man so that He could become our substitute. Let's read on in the verse. It says, "But we see Him who was for a little while made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with honor and glory because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God He might taste death for everyone." You see, the first reason why the incarnation was necessary was that Christ came to taste death. We know that God cannot die. We know that God is immortal in His very nature. His nature is self-sustaining. In Sunday school, we're studying systematic theology and we're going over the attributes of God. And one of the attributes of God we looked at today was His self-sufficiency, His self-sustaining. He is self-existent. God was not created, neither will God ever go out of being in existence. God is eternally existing. He is self-existent. He is not dependent upon anything else. Thus, He cannot die. God cannot succumb to death, and furthermore, not even angels die. The Bible says in Luke chapter 20, verse 36, Jesus is talking, and He says, talking about what will happen to the redeemed one day, He says, "For they cannot die anymore because they are equal to angels and are sons of God, being sons of the resurrection." See, right there He references the fact that when we are in heaven and we are immortal, when we go there and will not die, that we will be like the angels who also do not die. But Christ did not remain in a position where He could not die, and He did not become an angel so that He could be in another position where He could not die. Yet He became a man so that in a human nature, with a fully human nature, He could make Himself in a position where He could die. He became like us so that He could die for us. Everybody understand that? You with me on that? He became like us so that He could die for us. Only as a man could He lay down His life. Now I want to examine that phrase, tasting death, because as I was studying the passage and looking it over, that phrase kept rolling over my head. I kept wondering. It says, so by the grace of God, He might taste death. And I got to thinking, well, what does that mean? What has tasting death got to do with anything? And it dawned on me as I was studying, as I was reading, as I was looking at the passage, is that this is a reference to substitution. It is a reference to substitution because we all know this. Christ died as a substitute. That's why He died. He died in our place so that He would take our punishment and we could receive His reward. It's what we call substitutionary atonement. He atones for our sin by taking the punishment upon Himself. He died as our substitute. He took our place. He took the penalty of death so that we would not have to. Literally, He drank it for us. And the picture I want you to put in your mind is the picture of a king. Back in ancient times, kings would have cupbearers. And the cupbearer would serve the king in this way. The cupbearer would take the drink that the king was about to drink himself and would first take a drink of it for the purpose of determining whether or not that drink had poison in it. Can you imagine having that job? Some of you go to work tomorrow, thank your bosses that he doesn't make you drink every time. Here, drink this soda pop. I got somebody looking at me. No, seriously. We have this idea in our mind. Here's a king. What does the king do? He makes the cupbearer drink the cup. Why? Because in drinking the cup, he becomes the king's substitute. He drinks it so that if there is any poison in the cupbearer receives it. If there is any death in the cupbearer takes it in himself, so that the king remains unharmed. He is literally standing in, he's substituting himself. He would be, if necessary, the king's substitute in death. And the idea of substitution is seen here in this verse. Jesus tastes death for His people. He takes away our cup of punishment from our mouths, and He drinks our cup of punishment to the dregs. I'm reminded of Jesus in Matthew 26. And you all know the story of Jesus the night before He went to the cross in Matthew 26, where He went out into the garden and He cried for mercy. He said in verse 39, and going a little further, He fell on His face and prayed, my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Then in verse 42, He says again and again for a second time, He went away and prayed, my Father, if this cannot pass unless I drink it, your will be done. Now, so many people confuse that cup. So many people think that the cup was the cross, in the sense that Jesus was trying to get out of the physical punishment. But the cup that Jesus was referring to was not the physical punishment. The cup that Jesus was referring to was the wrath of God. Because when Jesus was on the cross, and He said, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's a reference to the wrath of God falling upon Christ for you and for me. God's wrath fell upon Christ. At that moment, that's the cup that Jesus drank. It wasn't the cross. 30,000 plus people died on crosses in the first century. Jesus wasn't the only person to ever suffer a terrible death. We see people die terribly every day. It wasn't the physical truth. This is where, as many of you enjoyed the Passion of the Christ, it was well done. And you see a lot of the physical torture that Jesus went through, but at the same time, it wasn't about the physical torture. It was about the wrath of God.